I'll go on to virtual machines and let me create a new VM. Here, let me create a new resource group. Give a simple name for the machine. Use North Europe. Don't need any infrastructure redundancy. In the security type, I'll leave it as standard. I'll leave the image as Windows Server 2019 data center. I'll leave the size of the administrator account services. I'll allow traffic on networking. That I and a slash that I have additional subnet gateway that is known as the IP address and actually connect off a private, and I'll go on to manage machine in place. Go ahead onto the resource. The process, I'm going to install the webs. Go on to next on install. Let's wait till this is again. I just open code. I'll go on that this is working. Let's mark it onto this chapter, and it's part of an Azure virtual network. Now we want to connect onto its private IP address from our own personal machine, and we're going to do this via a VPN connection. Now, when it comes onto VPN connection, firstly on your laptop or on your workstation device, you need to install a VPN client, and I'll show you how to do this. So that VPN client will actually be responsible for establishing a point-to-site VPN connection onto the Azure virtual network. On the Azure side, we have to install something known as a virtual network gateway. That virtual network gateway will be responsible for creating or establishing that point-to-site VPN connection with your laptop, with your workstation. Now, in order for that virtual network gateway to create that VPN environment on the Azure side, it needs to have its own host of virtual machines that is responsible for having that VPN connection in place. So for that, as part of your Azure virtual network, you have to create something known as a gateway subnet. This gateway subnet will actually be used for hosting the gateway virtual machines and services. So that entire VPN service, because see, normally in order to establish a VPN connection, you need a client and you need a VPN server. Now, instead of you actually implementing your own VPN server, which you can do, so you can create an Azure VM. You can install a VPN software. There are a lot of VPN softwares in the market. You can then configure that VPN software and you can establish a VPN connection from the client onto that VPN server. But here we are looking at a managed service on Azure. We are looking at the virtual network gateway, which will actually give us that sort of managed environment wherein we don't have to manage the underlying VPN software, and we don't need to manage the underlying infrastructure that manages that VPN connections, because we can have multiple connections from the client side, and all of that will be managed now. Those connections will be managed by that virtual private network gateway devices, which is going to be managed by Azure themselves. So in order now to have this managed environment, you need to have a gateway subnet in place. This needs to be empty. You should not be hosting any of your own Azure virtual machines within this gateway subnet. So the VMs in the gateway subnet are configured with the required VPN gateway settings. I said no other VMs must be deployed onto the gateway subnet. Here you can configure the gateway subnet as a /29. It comes onto the side of block. Microsoft also recommends that you can use /27 and /26 as well. So that's what we're going to do. Let's go ahead and create the gateway subnet. So what we can do is we can go on to the virtual network that is hosting our Azure VM. Here we can go on to subnets, and here we have the ability now to add a gateway subnet. So the name is gateway subnet. I'll accept the subnet address range as it is. Again, you can also follow Microsoft recommendations. For now, I'll just leave it as it is, and I'll click on save. So we need to have this gateway subnet in place. Now, once you have the gateway subnet in place, you can see you can't add another gateway subnet. So you can only have one per virtual network. Now we can actually go ahead and create a resource based on the virtual network gateway service. So I'll open up all resources, the link up in a new tab. Here, I'll create a new resource. I'll search for virtual network gateway. I'll hit on create. Here, I'll give a name for the gateway. I'll choose the same region as my virtual network. So I need to link this onto the virtual network itself. Here I'm creating a VPN gateway, so the gateway type will be VPN. In terms of the VPN type, I'm going to choose route based. Here we have different SKUs, so these are different pricing models when it comes onto the virtual network gateway. Based on the SKU, the pricing model that you choose, you get features accordingly. I'll leave it as the default. I'll leave it as the newest generation. Here in the virtual network, I can choose the Azure network that we have. You could also create a new network as it is. Now, because we have a gateway subnet within this virtual network, that's why it's being auto-populated over here. Now, we need to create a new public IP address. So this public IP address is going to be assigned onto the virtual network gateway. And don't worry, as we complete this implementation of the point-to-site VPN connection, we'll look at the role of this public IP address. For now, let me just go ahead and create or mention a new public IP address name that is going to be assigned onto this virtual network gateway. So this public IP address is going to be created automatically by the wizard itself. I'll leave the other settings as they are, and I'll go on to review and create, and then I'll go ahead with the creation of the virtual network gateway. Now, please note that it will take time to have the virtual network gateway in place. Now, in another tab, I've opened up the virtual network gateway is in place. You can go ahead on resource. And here, if you actually go on to the point-to-site configuration, here is where you can actually configure the point-to-site configuration itself. For now, let's mark it in onto this chapter. I want to show you how to generate certificates that will be used for the authentication process in the point-to-site VPN connection. Now, from your laptop or from your workstation, you are going to create a connection to the virtual network gateway that we did earlier on that will be attached onto our Azure virtual network. Now, when it comes on to the connection itself, there needs to be some form of authentication. It should not be the case that any machine should be able to establish a point-to-site VPN connection. So for example, let's say a company has an Azure virtual network in place and that virtual network is accepting point-to-site VPN connections. It has the virtual network gateway resource in place. It would only want to have trusted machines to have the ability to establish a point-to-site VPN connection. And the way of ensuring that only trusted machines can actually have the ability to establish this connection is to go ahead and ensure that certificates are actually installed on these client machines. This is one form of authentication. If the client has a valid certificate, then yes, they should be able to authenticate and create that point to site VPN connection. So, in terms of authentication, we need to ensure that we have these client certificates in place. Now, when it comes to generating these certificates, if you are trying this out, what you can do is you can create something known as a self-signed root certificate first. So you yourself are signing a root certificate. Then you create a client certificate out of this root certificate, and the client certificate is actually installed on the workstation on your laptop. The public key of the root certificate will then be imported onto the point to site configuration of the virtual network gateway. Normally, in a large organization, they might actually get their certificates from an enterprise CA authority. So this could be an authority, could be having their own software in place that only this enterprise CA client devices. But in our case, since we just want to try this out, we can create our own certificates, our own root certificate, and then create a client certificate out of this root certificate. So normally in a production-based environment, in a company environment, you would not do this, because here this is not a trusted way of generating certificate. This is something that you can do. And you can actually follow the Microsoft documentation, which is and the client certificate out of that self-site. There are other ways that you can also go ahead. Root certificate and the client certificate are available here. Certificate and if client certificate once. The only thing that I have changed is the common name when it comes onto the subject when creating the self-signed root certificate. Here also the subject when creating I have. So here I have both of the commands. The only thing that I have changed is the common name when it comes onto the subject when creating the self-signed root certificate. Here also when it comes on to generating the client certificate, again I've changed the common name. So when we are creating the root certificate, which is over here, in PowerShell, this root certificate will then be assigned onto this cert variable. And then when we are using this command to create the client certificate, which is important, this client certificate needs to be installed on the client machine that is going to establish the point to site VPN connection. So this client certificate is actually using the cert variable, which actually points on to our root certificate when it comes on to signing our client certificate. So again, I'm not going into depth because this is from a authentication when it comes on to point to site VPN connections. Sure to open up PowerShell as an administrator. I'm on a Windows 10 device. I'm opening PowerShell as an administrator, and then I'll go ahead and execute these commands. So that's done. I'll execute the next command. And I now have my certificates in place. So again, I'll ensure to have this link as a resource onto this chapter so that if you have any issues in terms of issuing these commands. Now, once you have these certificates in place on your machine, you can go ahead onto the search bar and you can type in certificates. Here you have to ensure to choose manage user certificates. And here if you go on to personal, if you go on certificates, you can see your VPN cert and you can see your VPN root certificate. So with this, you are certain that you have these certificates in place. So now let's mark an end onto this chapter wherein we now have the certificates in place when it comes onto authentication. Now in the previous chapter, we had created our certificates. Now in this chapter, let's configure our virtual network gateway. So here we need to now configure the point to site configuration. So going on to our virtual network gateway, if I go on to point to site configuration, I can click on configure now. The first thing I need to do is to configure an address pool. So I'm configuring a private IP address range for the address pool. So an IP address from this address pool will actually assign on to the client machines that are actually establishing this point to site VPN connection. In the tunnel type, we have many options in place. So again, this depends on the type of secure tunnel that you want to establish when creating this point to site VPN connection. I'm going to go ahead and choose IKE version 2. In the authentication type, we have many authentication types in place. I'm going to now choose an Azure certificate. And here is where we can actually upload our certificate data. So here I can just give a name. Then I need to go on to my certificates. I then need to go on to my VPN root, which is my root certificate. I need to right click all tasks and hit on export. Here in the wizard, I'll go on to next. I will not export the private key. I'll go on to next. This will be base 64 encoded. I'll go on to next. Here I'll browse for my desktop. So I'll just save it here. Go on to next and hit on finish and hit on OK. So here in File Explorer, I've gone on to my desktop. I can see my root certificate in place. I'll just right click and I'll open it up in Notepad. So here I'll choose more apps and I'll choose Notepad. Here I can see my certificate data. So I'll just copy this. I'll do a Control C. Here I'll place or do a Control V to paste in the public certificate data. And then let me click on save. So remember again, we have two certificates in place. We have our root certificate and out of that we have generated the client certificate. So now the root certificate data is part of our point to site configuration of our virtual network gateway, and the client certificate is going to be on our local machine, on our laptop or on our workstation. So now when the laptop tries to establish a point to site connection onto this virtual network gateway, this client certificate is going to be used for authentication purposes. And because this client certificate is being generated from this root certificate itself, this root certificate data should be able to authenticate a client that actually has this client certificate in place. So any client now which needs to establish a point to site VPN connection needs to have this client certificate installed. Now the saving of this configuration data takes a couple of minutes. Let's wait till this is complete. Once the setting has been saved, I'll go ahead and now download the VPN client. So now this is a client that needs to be installed on every machine that is going to establish a point to site VPN connection. So if me on my laptop or on my workstation, if we now want to establish a point to site VPN connection onto the Azure virtual network, we need to have this client in place. So in addition to having the client certificate in place, we also need to have this client also in place. Now before I can actually move forward, let me do one thing. I'll go on to demo VM. Just close this. Here let me go on to networking. I'll go on to the network interface. I'll go on to IP configurations. I'll go on to the IP config and I'll disassociate the public IP address and let me click on save. So I want to ensure that we now only communicate on the private IP gateway zip folder in place. I'm going to copy this. I'll just go on to my temp folder and let me place it here. I'll extract all of the contents. Here I'm going to go on to Windows AMD 64-bit because I'm on a Windows machine, a 64-bit machine. Here in the VPN client setup, I'm going to right click and I'm going to run this as an administrator. So here I'll click on More Info and I'll click on Run Anyway. Now again, if your laptop has any sort of restrictions when it comes on to the admin privileges, so this might be an issue. You have to ensure that you have full administrative permissions over your laptop, over your workstation. So here it's asking me to install the VPN client. I'll click on yes. Once this is done, I need to go on to my Windows menu. And here I need to go on to VPN settings. So I'm just typing in VPN and going on to VPN settings. Now here we can see that we have now a VPN connection in place that's known as Azure Network. So I'll just choose this and I'll hit on connect. I have now a dialog box in place. I'll hit on connect. I'll hit on connect here. It is now establishing the connection and we are now connected. Now that we are connected, what I'll do is, let me go on to demo VM. Here I'll go on to the overview, so we don't have a public IP address. Let me now take the private IP address. I'll copy it. I'll go on to a new tab. I'll do a default.html and I can see the home page. So now my machine has established a point-to-site VPN connection onto the Azure virtual network, and now we can connect, or we can actually use now the private IP address of the Azure virtual machine.